Good midday, all, and welcome to Widline Cadet in conversation with Didier William, Madjeen Isaac, and Abigail Lucien. This is the first of 4 public programs in support of the exhibition Never As I Was, Studio Museum Artist in Residence 2020-21 on view at MoMA PS1 through February 27th. My name is Dan Huff, and I'm the Director of Public Programs and Community Engagement here at the Studio Museum in Harlem. On behalf of the public programs team, including Melania Graham, who is running the back end today and the entire museum, we'd like to thank you for joining us now that your options for engagement include both the digital and in-person worlds again, and for many of you, you're in the middle of the workday. We are grateful to Sino Captions for providing live cart captioning and Pro Bono ASL for ASL interpretation. Captioning can be activated by selecting the CC button in the Zoom menu bar at the bottom of your screen. During the program, if you feel called to, please feel free to use the chat feature to react, respond, and connect, with a mindfulness that within this space we share that you show kindness, compassion, and respect towards our panelists and your fellow attendees. Today's program was conceptualized in collaboration with 2020-21 Artist in Residence Widline Cadet, who wanted an opportunity to be in intimate dialogue with a cohort of fellow Haitian American artists whom she's long admired but never had the chance to engage. I want to say so much more, but I'll refrain because there's so much to explore over the next hour and a half. So you have a sense of today's program flow. Each artist will offer a brief presentation of their practice, and then they'll open things up for conversation moderated by Didier. There will be time for questions and answers after the conversation, so please enter them in the Q&A box found in the mini bar at the bottom of the screen. And with that, I would like to first invite Widline to the screen as I read her bio. And we'll also bring up the slides as well. Widline Cadet is a Haitian-born artist. Her practice draws from personal history and examines race, memory, erasure, migration, and Haitian cultural identity from a viewpoint within the United States. She uses photography, video, and installations to construct a visual language that explores notions of visibility and hypervisibility, Black feminine interiority, and selfhood. And so I pass along to Widline.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Melania, and the entire Studio Museum team for all the hard work of putting this together. It's been a long time coming, and I'm really just grateful for everything that you guys have done to make this happen. Thank you, Didier, Abigail, and Madjeen for your generosity and for being here today with me. I'm just going to give a very brief overview of the body of work I've been working on. It's also the work that's included in the Studio Museum Artist in Resident exhibition at PS1, Cérémonie Disparition. And yeah, that's about it. So I started working on this work after I made another project about my family. And through the making of that work, I realized there were barely any records of previous generations of my family, starting with my grandparents. Specifically, my maternal grandmother, there are no photographs of her. I don't think she was ever photographed. And so thinking about that and the fact that she passed away over 50 years ago, and that the people who knew her, mostly her children who are left now, mainly only have mostly faded memories of her. And that maybe in a few years, maybe in a few generations, we won't even remember that she existed, in the manner of speaking. And so in thinking about her and all of the previous generations before her that have been forgotten through the passage of time, and also thinking about where my family is right now, in terms of us being the first generation to immigrate to the US, and fearing that it's only a matter of time before I think we lose our connection to Haiti and our ancestry, which I think is already happening in some ways, specifically with the next generation after me. And so in making Cérémonie Disparition, ritual disappearances, I'm thinking about my family history, Haiti's history, and the United States history, as well as the shared history and present relationship between the two countries, and how all of these things have shaped our experiences, especially living now. And so I wanted to create a record and a sort of archive of all of these things before they're gone. And so I've been making self-portraits, photographing my mom, sisters, and having friends and strangers alike role play as my double, and also as family members. And those family members include those who are here and present now, but also those from previous generation, but also imagining future generations of my family. And in doing so, I'm interested in creating a space where time, distance are transcended, and I'm able to have conversation with multiple generations of my family. Also, while speaking to the like larger issues relating to migration from the Caribbean to the US specifically. Yeah, and so I'm interested in the idea of creating memories or the invention of it. And I'm both using archival images from family albums. I'm also creating these archival images as well as in some way replicating some of those images, as well as fabricating these. So in a sense, the archive become this thing that's fictional, but based in my biography, based in our family biography and history. And so in doing that, I'm interested in having the space, both within the work itself, within the images themselves, but also creating a physical space where all of these different generations of my family can converse, they can literally talk to each other across the space of a gallery or across the space of an image. And yeah, that's about it.
Thank you, Widline. And next, if Madjeen would join me on the screen. Madjeen Isaac has rooted her practice in her Haitian American identity and Afro-diasporic stories. She explores themes of nostalgia and familiarity by reconstructing and assembling melanges of urban and tropical environments to create utopias and realms of her imagination. Growing up in a predominantly Caribbean neighborhood and being a first-generation American influences Isaac's process of commemorating memories and cultures that have shaped her upbringing.
Thank you, Dayan. And I'm really excited to be here sharing space with Widline, Didier, and Abigail, and overall City Museum, because I've been here, or I've been involved in this space for quite some time. So I'm really excited. I'm really interested in creating works about my Haitian American identity, as well as Afro-diasporic stories, and creating these utopia worlds for me and or realms of my imagination are a way to kind of set in space or set in place a world that we can live harmoniously. As a Haitian American, I feel like it's been difficult to find myself with the multiple ways of being. And I think creating these worlds help put these worlds together, and it helps me articulate really my upbringing, the cultural identities that I'm around constantly, and put to narrative in the forefront my family, people in my community. And I'm just really interested in merging greenery and urban tropical landscapes, kind of to really push forth a conversation of how can we introduce urban agriculture or agriculture, something that I feel like has been lost over time as families and folks from the Caribbean or Haiti migrate to the States because we're in this concrete jungle. But I think that I'm often painting things that I wish to see, things that I even feel. Yeah, I'm really obsessed with trying to find ways to bring forth these conversations and how we can tap back into our ancestral practices. And yeah, I think that I really love the idea of putting people in paintings who are in leisure, rest, actively doing something within the space, nurturing, tending to. And I'm really obsessed with just visual markers of both Brooklyn and Haiti. So the palm trees, graffiti, animals running freely, things that don't make sense and necessarily or actually are existing right now, but it makes sense to me. And yeah, I think that it creates this world where you can get lost into, and I think it's just really fun, complex compositions, and that are also kind of tapping into the complexities of my upbringing and folks that I often hear about their upbringings. I think that it's just really fun to play around with, and yeah. And also just thinking about how my works can be visual archives for future generations. I think that my works can also bring conversations about gentrification that's happening and how we can tap back into nurturing the land that we cultivate and occupy the spaces to the best of our abilities for agency and community healing. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Madjeen. And now I'd like Abigail to join me. Abigail Lucien is a Haitian American artist working in sculpture, time-based media, and language. Their practice looks at ways cultural identities and inherited colonial structures transmit to the body and psyche by challenging systems of assimilation through material.
Hello, hello. Thank you so much for coming to the space, and thank you, Widline, for inviting, and Didier and Madjeen for sharing, and everyone at the Studio Museum who has allowed this to happen. And so I thought I would begin with a little bit of biography. So my dad came to the States in '79 for the first time, where he met my mother. And shortly afterwards, they moved to Cap Haitien, where my dad was based beforehand. And so I left Haiti when I was around 4 years old, when my parents separated, and spent my youth about 9 months in the States and the summers at my dad's. So growing up in this and very evangelist and deeply spiritual family, I've always been interested in these intersections of belief and faith and myth, and how they have had the power to change the narratives around people and places for better or for worse. I also grew to be incredibly critical of both the church and this foreign fetish of fixing Haiti. So with that, I really consider my work to be autoethnographic. So from the materials and the language and the ideologies, the works really forefront my bulk bicultural heritage as a way of understanding and exploring these sort of inherited colonial structures and these systems of belief and care. My practice moves through sculptures and sort of fluidly actualizes itself in different mediums, right? So a sculpture becomes a poem, to become a performance that turns into an object. And so sometimes these objects are found and cast, and other times are created from scratch, but through the material translation of them, I'm looking for ways to implicate the body's relationship to the material and to place, to think about ways that we can understand large concepts as like loss and love and grief as processions, right? Rather than sort of states to reach or become. So I think about metal as both a drawing tool and as a way to address unseen systems and hidden forces at play. I also think about it, the significance of like iron and bronze in a geological way, and a way to sort of tie back to this ancestral land, thinking about the body as material and something to return to the earth as material once more. So thank you.
Thank you, Abigail. And finally, Didier. Didier William is originally from Port-au-Prince, Haiti. He earned an BFA in painting from the Maryland Institute College of Art and an MFA in painting and printmaking from Yale University School of Art.
Wow, thank you, Dayon, and thank you to everyone at the Studio Museum. And thank you, Widline, for bringing us together this afternoon. We spent all this time preparing all these ideas, and then now seeing all of you present your work this morning, I have a whole new set of ideas that I want to dig into for our conversation, which we'll get to in just a bit. My name is Didier William. I was born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. And my family and I moved to the United States when I was 6 years old. And shortly thereafter, I think I began to be both sort of curious, but also to a certain extent obsessed with the narratives of the place that I was born. My brothers and my mom and dad, and for most of our families, always sort of had these narratives they carried with them. Some of the sort of oratory and the archives that have been mentioned by Widline. And I became really interested in those narratives and how they might specifically intersect and in some ways taint some of the present moment, and how that complicates ideas around representation and building a narrative. And so for me, at stake in the work has always been this idea that bringing multiple times and multiple spaces together in the present moment is a sort of a crescendo of representation that I always wanted to sort of get to. Trying to locate the work in a temporal space that was much more about presence than it was about articulating a kind of past or projecting into a kind of future. If I could bring my viewer forcefully into the present moment to deal with the bodies and the narratives and the symbolism that I was drawing from, in some cases, Haitian mythology and Haitian history, but often in a distinctly immigrant narrative, a narrative of a Haitian identity that is rooted here in the United States. The multiplicity of that, I think, is really what has always interested me, and how we can locate it in the present, and how it affects what we think and say about representation and limits of representation. On a formal level, that kind of friction has always been the line between, say, abstraction and representation. But on a much more personal and philosophical level, I sort of understood that to be the condition of being an immigrant, having to constantly sort of contend with past histories that are both accessible and inaccessible in various ways, but also being forcefully rooted and situated in the present moment. For that reason, at one point in my work, it became really interesting to me to kind of strip the conventional signifiers of representation away from how the figures and how the bodies presented themselves. And I started carving these eyes into the surfaces of the panels that insisted on a kind of return of the gaze. And so to see these in person, once you're sort of close enough to identify that the body is made up of this topography of eyes, you're also hyper aware of the fact that they're looking back at you. And this idea of visibility, I think, is something that I was thinking about this recently. My parents sort of move about the world in this way, and I observed it in them growing up. And it wasn't until recently that I realized that this is now this sort of larger strategy in my practice. Them being sort of hyper aware of being seen and how their bodies are read in this place where we weren't born, and that we've sort of adopted and has adopted us as part of our identity and part of ourselves. That kind of reflexive circuitry of the gaze, I was really, really interested in materializing it. If I could fix that in a kind of material condition, what would it look like? And it really became these eyes that kind of completely covered the surfaces of the bodies. But that sort of evolved, that same gesture, that same ornamentation has evolved into every sort of other part of the paintings. And so now that kind of molecular way of building up and breaking down space on a modular level has become part and parcel to how I think about, the narratives that are being built, the history of those narratives, the ground on which those narratives are situated, and what kind of cross-pollination is happening between this place that is my present and Haiti that is part of my ancestry and part of a large part of my biography. And I want to kick us off with a question that stuck in my mind almost immediately after Dayon reached out. And it was the first question that I had in mind as I read the email from Dayon on my phone, and then I got in the car to drive home. And the first thing I thought about was mapping. I thought about the sort of gesture of claiming space, particularly within immigrant populations. How Haiti gets mapped into and onto all of your work, I've found really fascinating. We lean in within the kind of spaces that your bodies are situated in. Abigail, you mentioned the sort of implicating a subjectivity within the places that your objects are installed in, objects that are in some ways sort of mythological or pointing to potential futures. And Madjeen, quite literally, your paintings that map a sort of cityscape, that is living in both a kind of observed reality, but also a kind of fictive reality. And I'm seeing a sort of through line there that definitely includes a multi-generational relationship to Haiti. But I'm wondering if you all might, just to kind of get us going, if you all might say some more words about that gesture of sort of mapping and claiming space, claiming a space that is intrinsically Haitian in your work. And maybe Widline, since you brought us all together, maybe we can start with you if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. I think that is a hard question because I feel like I do it on instinct a lot of the time. And so for me to put it into words has been like this battle of me like trying to learn language again. But I think in the way that I map Haiti within my work, a lot of it is based on memory. A lot of it is, I don't know, there's this weird thing that happens for me with my experience of migrating here is that like a lot of what I know, a lot of what I think I know about Haiti is based on my parents' knowledge of it. It's also based on the fact that a lot of the earlier things that I learned about Haiti was also based on me being within the space. So a lot of it was learned from that. So I think the way that I like map Haiti is like this hybridity of like push and pull at times versus like the things that my parents know, but also the things that I experience when I go back as well. Showing up within my work where it's like very much things that maybe only I know sometimes, but also things that I hope is resonating with other people when they see my work. It happens when I like photograph landscape. I will photograph landscape that resembles Haiti for some reason based on the plant life, but also I think specifically thinking about like the way that my mom has somehow mapped Haiti into her home, into how she makes her home. That's something that's like really resonated with me. And so thinking about all of those things and like imaging those in that same way has been like the thing for me.
I love that answer, and thinking about the home or the domestic space as like the first iteration of that map. Because many of us who are from other places live in homes that include artifacts and items that are strewn about, that our parents brought with us. I know my mom had this big briefcase that was under her and my dad's bed. And it was all the stuff that they brought from Haiti, stuff that they never put up, but it was just sort of shoved under the bed. And whenever they went to church on Sundays, I would go under there and just pilfer through it and pull stuff out and find patterns and find photos and just find this like archive that you spoke of during your talk. And I would stick it back under there so they didn't know I was there. And then next week I'd do it again. So it was this like really sort of brilliant kind of map, so to speak, of this place we left behind. Abigail and Madjeen, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
I was thinking about, Widline, when I first saw your work, that was one of the most like sort of striking things, is that I could see these objects within the home that immediately sort of transported me into homes that I've been in, right? Like, or my own, right? Like the flowers, different types of plastics, different types of like decor, and so it's funny to think about, when it comes to, mapping, it's about like a way of finding something, right? Like a way of even sort of, locating yourself, right? And so I think about that sort of like mapping of Haiti, and my work sometimes like quite directly. There's a lot of like moments of metal that I've directly have like traced from something that I've seen, that then it becomes like abstracted and taken out, or cinder blocks that I've seen people making, and I'll remake them in the States. And in a way, that sort of experience is also kind of reflective of this abstraction of the home too, right? Like my abstraction of like my experience with Haiti too, right? Like, partially, like even, I've spent most of my life in the United States, but my home still, right, is in this other space, like where I sort of identify. And so in a way, it sort of like fractures, an understanding of like how you place yourself in time. So I kind of like, and like taking these sort of pieces and like digesting them through like a different material, sometimes they're able to become in that in-between space that exists, right, in that sort of like meshed world, and not of one or the other. And oftentimes I feel that's sort of a story of migration, right? Is that even with content of like where you are, there's always a sort of yearning of maybe where you've come from. So yeah.
Madjeen?
Yeah, these were all great responses, and I resonated a lot with all. And I think I'm thinking more so about how I think for a long time I kept my Haitianness and Americanness separate, because being at home felt very different from when I stepped outside of home, going to school and just, entering the outside and real world. But I think that I eventually made the thing where I wanted it to be harmoniously, or like I wanted to live in both spaces and accept my Haitian Americanness through merging images that I would find. So these deconstructing images that I would take throughout Brooklyn, and even like images that I have from back home Haiti from my trips, and looking through old family photographs, and intentionally like recreating these worlds so that I can feel that they belong. And I think also living in Flatbush, I've been oblivious that I've been already living in a cultural whirlwind. And I eventually, after my trip to Haiti, I became more observant, and I realized how similar we were. And I think it just, became important for me to preserve, commemorate, and, really highlight narratives of people occupying these spaces, and how they either migrate to Flatbush for the first, second, or third stop. And, they probably came to Flatbush, with pre-intentions or pre-notions of what it possibly was. But once they settled here, they felt very at ease and at home. And so I was able to find so much familiarity and nostalgic feelings from memory, thinking a lot about my trips back home, and also just thinking about my upbringing in childhood, and yeah, through oral stories and family photos. So,
Madjeen, I might, I want to dig deeper a little bit into what you just said, because I thought it was so beautiful. And maybe this takes us into the more individual questions. But I think the question of mapping is so interesting, particularly for your work, because you describe like that kind of living between two spaces, right? Particularly as a young person, you have parents who are Haitian, and then you're living in the United States with a completely different language and probably experiencing a different language at home. And we can identify it as two different spaces, but is there a certain extent to which there's a kind of tertiary space that's built that is, how do I want to say it, unrelated to either? Is there a different kind of mythological tertiary space that exists that becomes its own subjectivity, independent, right? Your paintings have a like beautiful Flatbush train platform, but then right above it, there's palm fronds and a scene that looks like it was plucked right out of the landscape in Haiti. So there's a kind of hybridity there that I think is really powerful, that really becomes another space. It becomes a different space, and it includes a sort of landscape that is both seen and unseen, which I think is again a very specific condition of a kind of immigrant reality, where there's a part of your subjectivity that is left behind, that is inaccessible, that is stored away, that becomes sort of exchangeable in particular ways. So I'm wondering about what that other space is, and how do you distinguish it from a kind of particularly American sensibility or particularly Haitian sensibility? I want to kind of give it, I'm thinking if there's a way to give it its own sort of discretion.
I think what you're asking is like, is there like an in-between? I don't know, I think that there's always like an imbalance, because I'm occupying both spaces, and it's always about me finding groundedness and centeredness. And so I don't know if there's like an in-between. I think me being Haitian American is the in-between. Like it can't get more in-between than that. But yeah, I think that even just like listening to stories of both Haitian descent and Caribbean descent and how we're similar, I think that just finding commonalities and differences and interests through that really helps me understand that, you know, we can all have all these differences within us and still live in a way where we can express freely like how we decide and not necessarily have to choose. Yeah, I think that that's the best way I can answer that.
Yeah, in past conversations around your work, I think I've seen you mention mythology and different ways of formulating a narrative. Do you think mythology plays a role in how you make those decisions as you go from piece to piece?
When I think of mythology, I think of like fictional, utopia. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of it is also intentionally not creating images that are of suffrage, but really creating images that, you know, celebrate one's existence. Thinking about how my family back home, and they grow their own foods. My uncle has his own like garden and growing his own foods and tending to the earth, and wanting to bring that narrative here, and hopefully, you know, we can eventually step into that. But I think I'm really intentional about making sure that people that I'm painting are doing these things of nurturing and being in community and an agency, so that they also feel like, you know, it's possible and they're able to do that and feel seen and heard. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on the question of mapping with Abigail. And looking at your work, I find myself thinking a lot about gravity, which I think about in my own work as well, particularly as a kind of tenet or as a kind of condition of representation. And it always resonates with me when an artist is clearly intending to kind of shake up how we relate to gravity and how the objects in the work relate to gravity. It makes the ground legible. It makes density and weight legible, especially as a sculptor. It's quite literally a function of your making. What do you think the relationship is between gravity and representation, especially for someone invested in a kind of narratives of immigration?
Mhm. Yeah, I love this question. I think about, I often think about my works having their own access and entirely, right? Like they sort of exist in sometimes their own sort of you know, ability to be both like fortified and yet like ephemeral at the same time, right? And that's like sort of through material, right? But then also through like representational form, right? Like what does a cinder block do, right? Like how does it support? Yet how does a cinder block sort of support when it's made of butter, right? Like how long can that sort of infrastructure last? And so I think that this sort of conversation of gravity and legibility sort of is intertwined with this, you know, this notion of rebuilding in Haiti, right? This sort of like essence or like movement towards like fixing or, you know, sort of messing with like the purposefully like debilitated infrastructure that we see within the country, right? But then there's also this kind of like line, I think, that the work is then able to kind of use gravity and use like color as a way of sort of altering that sort of ground that it might have to sort of like add hope isn't the word, but you know, it's the essence, right? It's like this sort of like ability to, you know, do something that we kind of couldn't ever imagine, you know, like, and I think that that's where that space of like, I know this is a little bit of like Madjeen's question, but like the space of mythology sort of enters into my work as well, right? Is a space of, you know, how Haiti has been able to do these, or like the impossible has been done there in ways because of the fact that it's not bound to the limits of the same understandings, right? So this idea that if, you know, if you're sort of not grounded to the same space or the same sort of like forced legibility, then maybe you're able to do anything that's sort of imaginable.
Do you think it serves to implicate your viewer in a kind of condition or facsimile of instability, so that you're not just dictating to them a narrative of ruin or trauma that's over there, but the actual exhibition space itself is one in which they're finding themselves off kilter, trying to measure and remind themselves the distance from this wall to here, or the distance from the subject to this wall,
Right.
because your object is quite literally seeming as if it's going to topple over or something. Do you think there's some of that in there?
Yeah, I definitely think it's less about sort of thinking about ruin elsewhere and more so thinking about the sort of like visceral bodily experience that you're having to negotiate when you're in the room with the work, right? Like sort of question, almost kind of like posing a question, right? Like is this leaning or am I, right? Or, you know, like I've always thought that like the head tilt to like look at something is like, I love it, you know, because it's this like, you know, it's this reaction that you're having without really thinking, you know, to be able to have this sort of visceral like, oh, maybe if my body were actually to adjust, we would come to some sort of solution here, right? Rather than asking for everything else to bend or to move or to arch.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of interested. I'm definitely interested in, you know, asking the viewer to see a little bit differently.
Yeah. I love that answer, and it's something as a painter, it's something I think about a lot too. I've always been a huge fan of Colescott's work, and I think he does that quite a bit in his paintings, where you always feel like there's some kind of foundational instability with this profoundly historical and complex narrative that's being told to you, but then it seems like the actual infrastructure of the painting is sort of off kilter, so you end up doing that kind of head tilt, and I love how you described it. Widline, did you want to follow up on that? I saw you enthusiastically nodding.
No, I was thinking about my reaction to Abigail's work when I first saw it, and I was just like, I think there's always like this very precarious thing with balance and the sculpture work especially, and I'm like, how fragile is it? I haven't seen it in person, which I'm very much looking forward to in your show, but I'm curious about like the fragility of like things standing up and like them toppling over and like me being anxious and more looking at it as well. So that I was really excited when you talked about that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And speaking of that kind of slight instability, or rather not quite instability, Widline, I wanted to ask you about Cérémonie d'Expiation, which you spoke of a little bit in the beginning. And the series and its title was immediately striking to me. Are you thinking about disappearance as a strategy for survival? Is one of my questions. But then I'm also find it interesting that in most cases, it seems like the characters aren't actually disappearing. They're multiplying, they're sort of folded into each other, they're webbed into one another, they're dissolving into water, they're dissolving into the landscape. I guess in some ways disappearing can be read as somewhat nihilistic, but I'm guessing you mean it here as a kind of radical liberation. Is that a correct assumption? And if so, can you say more?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think when I'm really interested in thinking about the experience of moving here in a lot of ways, the experience of the inevitable, oh my God, I can't say inevitably disappearing. I think one of the primary concerns of my work is just like thinking about the future and thinking about being here now. And one of the things that happens as an immigrant is losing like part of yourself, losing losing part of yourself. And we don't talk about it a lot because a lot of the times we are focused on the, I don't know, the more like idealistic aspect of being an immigrant. But I do see, I think, yeah, the idea of thinking of disappearing as like a ritual that happens, it is nihilistic. I will say that. I do view it in a nihilistic way in some aspect, but at the same time, I think it's just one of those things that happens inevitably. But I also feel like going back to the question you posed for Madjeen, the idea of like creating this third space, I'm interested in being in control in my work, at least, of how that idea is reiterated, but at the same time, because it feels like a disappearance, but at the same time, it feels like something else because you are merging with the landscape, you are merging with the cultures here. And I think that in and of itself becomes this other thing, this other space, this other way of being. Yeah, and I like to view it as like a powerful place to view this experience from.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I also think about it as a kind of anonymity, because I think as Madjeen, you pointed out in the beginning, as someone who grew up in an immigrant household, there are varying points, depending on where you grew up, what part of the country you grew up, where that otherness makes you vulnerable in very particular ways to various parts of the American population. And so the idea of disappearing, or the idea of becoming anonymous to some degree, or at least being able to kind of wield that anonymity as a kind of currency, becomes really kind of tantalizing, because in some cases it's a matter of survival. And so with that particular series of yours, I found that really powerful, that you were ritualizing this process of supposed disappearance, but the subjects and the pictures were doing anything but disappearing. They're actually becoming more present, but becoming present in this kind of alternate way, in this kind of unconventional, using these sort of unconventional strategies. In some cases, a kind of querying strategy that actually leads me to my next question about your work. You do there's a lot of work that sort of centers your mom. And I work with my dad a lot in my work, and so I resonated with that quite a bit. And I'm wondering about the sort of quotation of mom as a kind of gendered parental archetype. And it doesn't just show up in your work, it shows up in a lot of Haitian art, a lot of Haitian worship rituals. And I'm wondering how does queerness or non-binary gendered intimacy figure into this narrative of the Caribbean, if you think about that in the work at all?
I do. I definitely do. I think about it more so in context of my familial relationships. Even as a kid, one of the things that I didn't have language for it then necessarily, but one of the things that I was always so interested in was like these various ways in which like the women in my family were like breaking these gender boundaries, but also like having these very like intimate non-gendered relationships with each other.
Mhm.
And I'm so interested in exploring that in my work. And that's probably one of the focus of why I'm interested in like the relationships between my mother, her grandmother. And so I do think that my work is very gendered in one way, but I also use my mom as a model, not necessarily for her being my mom, but something more
Mhm.
that I don't think I quite have the language for. Yeah, I think there's ways that I envision her as something more than just my mom within my work in a lot of ways. And I don't necessarily have the language in terms of the words to say it, but I think through my work, I'm trying to figure that out. And yeah, I guess I'm in the process of figuring what that looks like, what
Yeah.
that means.
I mean,
You know?
she's deified in the work.
Yeah.
She's sort of made grand in the work, and I find myself thinking about Madonna and child motifs quite a bit. But in the Caribbean, it's not Madonna and child; it's Azuli and her daughter.
Mhm.
So there's a complete sort of shift of the typical archetype in how it functions in the Caribbean and other parts of the world. And I also think that the queering that I'm responding to in the work isn't just hypersexual, it's also in the multiplicity. Like you're taking the normative singular subjectivity of the body and you're expanding it across multiple bodies, the boundaries of which can't always be identified. And I think that's a particular kind of really smart queering strategy that takes away the singularity of what we usually identify with a body in space, let alone a feminized body in space. I wanted to pivot back to Abigail and ask about science fiction, which when I was thinking about these questions was like, it was like one of the last questions that came out. I was like, oh my God, there's a kind of a science fiction element to this work, both in the color and in some of the previous conversations around gravity, but also in how you think about the geography that you install the work in. I haven't yet seen one of your installations that was in like a sort of typical everyday space. It always seems to be a space that's intentionally contrived. Can you speak on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I love that you read science fiction because I love science fiction. And I always have, and the stories that have always kept, or I've kept close in science fiction are these stories that are like typically surrounded through a context of like the apocalypse, right? There is this reality that, in crisis, we see humanity, right? Like in crisis, we understand character, right? And even the word apocalypse it means to unveil, to reveal, to like disclose, right? The truth, right? And so I think about, these ideas or this like ability for science fiction to, you know, again, like exist outside of the limitations of what we have like laid grounding as a society that is possible. And so that comes into, you know, both matters of like physics, right, and geology and geography, but then thinking about like how those narratives can, you know, can tell us or like reveal more to us about what might be just like beneath the surface of things, or what might be sort of the moving parts of that narrative, right? Like on one sense, right, we have the, you know, this post-apocalyptic sense, but then maybe under it, it's a story of love, right? Like, or maybe it's a story of family, right? And so how those things are sort of negotiated and speak to each other. And for me, that kind of like exists in these spaces that, you know, can be altered or controlled by these symbols of a guard or a fence or a veil, or, you know, these like third spaces that that delineate, but then also sort of like narrate natural or artificial. And so that's sort of where the work ends up situating itself as well.
What I love about that is it also serves to kind of undermine this idea of Haiti as, you know, always Haiti, comma, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere,
Right.
which is a sort of very deliberate implantation by Western media to always paint Haiti in a very particular condition, the Western imagination. But what I find interesting about how you use that narrative is you situate all these other motifs and ideas of intimacy within this supposed sort of calamity. The evidence of which is there, right? You're working with these things that seem to be in ruin, or they seem to be in various states of decay, but they're being presented with this kind of flamboyance that forces the viewer into a very complicated emotional resonance, which takes us so much further than the typical narratives around like immigrant trauma. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think that, you know, in a lot of ways, like I've been thinking a lot about like beautifying spaces, like what that means, right? Like, and how, and oftentimes like we like bedazzle or, you know, sequin, or, you know, even in like tableaus, right? Like they're sparkling, right? And it's this mention of like to beautify something, to honor that thing, right? Like to make that thing sort of to adorn it, right? And so I've been thinking about that space where, you know, the sacred meets the secular in that space, right? Like, and how that, you know, that is able to, like, through color, right? It's able to sort of like appreciate, reappreciate, or reimagine a thing, right? And not imagine it just in, you know, an end result of ruin, but in this, like, again, this like consistent procession, right? Like this consistent sort of like growth, right? Like, and even in death is growth, is life, right? Like, and so this idea of, you know, this rebirth too, right? And it being this cycle rather than you know, a state that is sort of permanent.
Madjeen, did you want to add to that? I saw you nodding.
Yeah, I mean, I just really like the aspect of thinking of beautifying, but also like keeping things as is and working from there. Because I'm always drawn to the idea of how Haitians have always been resourceful and they work with what they have. And just what it means to like start from scratch and make something anew of it. And like when we migrate here, we are literally starting from scratch again, but with some aspects of like remembering and familiarity of our upbringing and past, and knowledge passed down from generations to generations. Yeah, I think that just the idea of beautification and or reimagining, I think that that's something it's also a privilege to be able to do that, because we're living in a world where we're working so much in a capitalist society, and we're kind of like positioned to just do that and that only. And typically when you're a first generation, it's up to you to like, you know, either pivot or, you know, make things to start anew in a way where you're kind of having to choose yourself, but also remembering your family. Yeah, I think that there are ways to go about making space for current generation as well as future generations to find your way and be able to have conversations and like develop their own language as they navigate this world through just ultimate, just crazy changes that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, I have like a question for Didier that I've been thinking about. I saw that the first time that I encountered your work, you were giving a talk at Syracuse University, and I was there as a grad student. And so I went in there not knowing what to expect because I hadn't seen your work before. And so I went and I sat in that auditorium and I cried the entire time you were giving your talk. And I didn't necessarily like know why I was crying when I was crying, but I was just crying in the dark and sniffling while you were trying to give a talk. But and I think like afterwards, after a while, I realized like one of the things that I was experiencing and giving and listening to you talk was this thing where like this is like one of the first time like that I as an artist went to a talk and felt like I was being seen and that my experiences and that of my family were being validated. And I think that's like something that like repeats and is explored in so many ways in your practice, both in terms of like the formal elements. For example, the figures being covered and carved in eyes, but also thinking about like the specificity of the subject matter that you explore, the language that you use, and also the choice in whose history or stories that you're exploring, and thinking about the different levels of legibility and I guess maybe accessibility as well that you offer to different viewers. There's a work that you do it in a lot of works, and I think a lot of the ways that you do it is through the use of Creole titles as well. Specifically, there's one titled Wageta Kone, so you'll know. I think sometimes that's one of the things that I'm like immediately I responded to is like the meaning for those words for me and the ways they don't necessarily translate the same way in English. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking about, I don't know, it's like a particular approach that's repeated in your work. And so I'm thinking about if you could talk about these very intentional choices that you're making within your work about these different levels of points of entry. Do you consider them equally important layers or do they function more in a hierarchy for you?
That's such a great question, and thank you, and thank you for the kind words. I remember that talk, and it was a lot of fun. You're gonna make me emotional. I do think about those things a lot. I think for me, it became a very apparent condition of loss in the work. And I became really hyper aware of language in the work when I had my first show in Miami, which is where I wasn't born in Miami, I was born in Haiti, but I was raised in Miami, my family lives in Miami. And I had this one particular exhibition in Miami, and I had, I think, 2 or maybe 3 paintings in the exhibition, and my mom and dad and one of my aunts came to the show. And they're always super enthusiastic and supportive about the work. But you know, within seconds after arriving into the space, they just made a beeline for the paintings that were in Creole, and they kind of stood in front of them and read them to themselves, and they started they had this own little separate story happening in front of the paintings that was independent of the painting, but they had access to it because the language sort of privileged them. And it made me hyper aware of the power of language. It made me hyper aware of the kind of condition of loss that happens through language sometimes. And not necessarily trying to sort of come back to the studio and change all of my titles into Creole, but becoming really aware and intentional about how language is used in the work, how it crosses the surfaces of the panels into the titling of the work, and really frames a condition for the viewer, sometimes long before the work even happens. So, in terms of the hierarchical question that you're asking, I think it depends on the work. It depends on the narrative. It depends on the anecdote. A lot of the work vacillates from personal to historical and back again. Thinking about a personal anecdote, thinking about visiting immigration and naturalization services to become US citizens back in the 90s before it was renamed to Homeland Security. A really interesting switch, by the way. And thinking about those like multiple narratives that took place while we were young, and how do I reinscribe a kind of present cognition over those narratives, and how do I name those narratives for my viewer? Do I choose to name those narratives with Creole language titles that, the three of you would certainly immediately gravitate to and know and understand? And if I do that, there's a sense of loss for a viewer who doesn't speak Creole. And am I okay with that loss? For example, I think 2 years ago, there was a series of works that were written up by a reviewer, and he was really congratulatory and really excited. It was a great write-up, and every single title was mistranslated and changed and altered. And one of my friends wrote me and said, "Have you seen this?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Are you going to correct him?" And I said, "No," because making that decision is something that I had to be content with very early on. And I also think, as someone who had to learn English as a second language, you're very aware of what's lost in translation during that process. And that condition of loss isn't something I'm interested in protecting my viewer from. They too can kind of experience that moment, even a small facsimile of it. Does that answer the question, Widline?
Yes. yes. Definitely.
I love that. And I wanted to piggyback on the idea of how Creole can either get, like you said, mistranslated, or it's simplified in the English language, or even doesn't exist sometimes. I think that there's so much cultural and emotional weight to using Creole as opposed to English. And it's making me think about one of my paintings called Remed, where it's of me and my family, my brothers and my parents and I around a table, and we're having an old Haitian remedy, like this concoction of like Bamako rum, ginger, clove, honey, aloe. And these were, remedies that were resurfacing during the pandemic, all through WhatsApp, through family members. And this had to have been like probably the 5th concoction. And my brothers and I in the painting, we look like as if we're just like not about it. Like we're saying, nah, I don't know. This is like, all the concoctions that we had they just tasted really like crazy. You can tell through our facial expressions. And my dad and my mom, they're on the other end. My dad is chugging it and my mom is happily pouring it. So there's this interesting duality happening in the painting where my parents, who are Haitian born, are familiar with it and are receiving it, whereas my brothers and I are just like, I don't know about this, and really opposed to it. But all to say, I called it Remed because I feel like Remed just holds that weight and has, it just feels very like ancient, and like it's something that's been passed down from generation to generation. So I think a lot about language. I have been thinking about it more after Widline's exhibition at Never As I Was, and just walking into the space and hearing Creole play in the background and realizing that, this can exist within our institution and feeling seen in that way. And also viewing your works, Didier, where, most of them are in Creole, and also kind of just looking at it through a contemporary sense. Made me realize that there are some things that aren't really talked about within the Haitian household, such as like, what is love or what is vulnerability? So it had me thinking of those things and how there are some taboo topics that I personally I don't think I have tapped into. But I think it's really important to think about that and include that language so that the people like our family and of Haitian descent can feel seen in that way. So
Absolutely. I mean, I love that response, and it makes me think about the other part of Widline's question, which I think was about my dad and how he figures so heavily.
That wasn't me. Who was it?
Oh, who was that? Was that Abigail?
I think that was my question.
Okay.
Yeah, I can read it out for you.
Oh, sure.
So my question was, it was relating to your father and how it seems like you often, or he impacts your work and he often shows up in ways where it's either through the title or through figures.
Mm-hmm.
And you make certain references through objects, referencing his personality as it relates to his political background in Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
And the works that I'm referring to, please excuse my Creole, Lage doam pavle which relates to put the curtains down, I don't want them to see me, and Mache tu patu avel, which means I walk around everywhere with it. Mm-hmm. And so the painting of the curtains relates to the idea of not wanting to be seen. Mm-hmm. And I remember you talking about, like, you know, your home was always dark because your dad just never wanted the curtains to be open. And the machete relates to memory of your father wielding machetes at home. And I was really taken aback by this. When you were going away to college, he expected you to bring a machete to school.
He did.
So I can't help but to go back to, you know, the motifs that you use, like the eyes, and how it forces the viewer to look within themselves and, you know, question themselves in reality. And, you know, as an artist creating these works, has it forced you to unlearn habits or confront resurfaced emotions you may have unconsciously picked up during your upbringing or buried away? And does the physical labor of, you know, creating these eyes, you know, does it also kind of step in as a therapist for you?
Yes to everything that you just asked. And that's like a whole nother Zoom. We could spend a whole nother hour and a half just on everything that you just laid out. My dad figures hugely into my work. I mean, I love the man so much in his complexity. And I was thinking about it the other day, and I think when my work started to get more and more personal, it sort of coincided with him having these health issues. But, you know, part of the beginning of your statement, you were talking about some of the more complex emotions and ideas that aren't always sort of nurtured in a Haitian household, especially ideas around masculinity and gender in a Haitian household. And I can certainly relate to that. And I remember, I think it might have been a talk around the time that Widline saw me at Syracuse. Somebody asked, you know, why do you work with your dad so much in your work? How come you don't work as much with your mom in your work? And I said, well, it's because I know my mom pretty well. My work becomes this kind of through line to kind of get to my father, who, in like many men of his generation, is in various ways inaccessible. And so the work becomes this kind of archaeological dig into his stories that I was part of, stories that I wasn't part of, stories that existed in Haiti, stories that existed here, things that I witnessed, things that he recounted in oratory, things that my mom told me, all of these ways in which I'm sort of batting around his identity to try to figure out, you know, who and what this man is, because his generation thought about gender in such a way that that kind of vulnerability was disallowed. And so for me, strategically, it becomes a way to think about it through the work. Now, I think part of the task I give myself is to be very clear about where the boundary exists between my identity as his son and my identity as an artist. And maybe more specifically, where does my freedom live between my identity as his son and my identity as an artist? And so sometimes he's in the work as himself, and sometimes he's in the work as a character, so that I can allow myself the critical distance to make the decisions that I need to make for the work. Because at a certain point, the work demarcates from him and becomes its own thing, and that's okay. That's a separation that I think is expected and allowed. But it's definitely, and you asked, does it become a kind of therapeutic? It doesn't. I don't think it becomes therapeutic. I think my work is really labor intensive, and not only do I enjoy it, but it also sort of forces me into a kind of mindfulness moment. It forces me into the present in a way that I think becomes almost tyrannical. And I've become way more interested in presence in painting than I am in truth. And so how do I build a surface? How do I build a picture? How do I build an image that forces my viewer not to some narrative existing over there, but to the present moment where their body and the object on the wall is being, they're subject to the same physical conditions. I think the labor in my work becomes a kind of practice of that in the making, which allows it to happen in the viewing.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks for sharing. I relate a lot to your works about your dad, because I think that when painting my dad as well, I'm also trying to understand who he is as a person, because I noticed that he doesn't open up much about his past growing up. It's really like through sometimes my mother, or when he actually sees a painting of himself, he then kind of like shares a little bit. But yeah, that sounds.
And I mean, if we think about Haiti's history, from sort of the 1950s onward, and we think about what was happening in the country under the Duvaliers, we don't have to go too far back to understand why this particular generation might have some difficulty accessing vulnerability, particularly to their very American offspring who have a very different relationship to this material. So there's a level of empathy that I have for that barrier. But the studio allows me to sort of take that empathy and make it productive.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hopping back on. This has been such a rich conversation that I don't want to interrupt, but I also want to honor the wonderful questions that some of our audience members have provided for you. But I just want to say this one sentence, because as I'm listening to this conversation, I think for anyone who has moved somewhere else and is in search of anchoring, I think this hour and a half has really been centered around this sense of you feel like home. And I just want to honor and appreciate the space that you're creating for everyone here. So first question is from Savannah, and this is for everyone. As you create third space access points for Haitian hyphenates, do you believe that there are access points for Haitians living in Haiti to join in this conversation and work? Or access points for Haitian futurity that include life in Haiti? One that does not totemize Haiti in an American context, but also extends futuristic possibilities to our peers on the other side of these mirrors and reflections.
Yes, I love that question, actually. I think part of my work is trying to, I don't know, project the futurity, like the futuristic possibilities for my peers and for myself. If I return to Haiti as well, I know that my life has been here for most of my life. There is always like I don't know, a want to return to. And so, yes, to all of those, definitely. There is definitely access points for that. Includes, I think, also that, like, I don't know, I feel like we talk about the third space. I will say that most of the third space is, most for me at least, is super influenced by my time in Haiti, by my family, by growing up Haitian and being Haitian. And so I do think, like, or at least I hope I'm doing it effectively, that these access points are there and that people are being able to like access them, whether they're here or in Haiti.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I resonate with both the question and Widline's answer. And I would also say, yes, there are access points, and there are more access points now than there were before. And I think thinking about ideas for work coming down the line, I think there'll be even more access points. But I also want to kind of, there's a subtext of an imperative of return in the question. like as if returning to Haiti is somehow an imperative. And I want to sort of take that out of the question a little bit, because I don't, for me, it's not an imperative. It's something that will happen at some point and I want to happen. But I think in order to sort of situate this condition of presence, which we can call a third space, which we can call, I think my friend and colleague, Vladimir Sibyl-Charrier in the chat called it an indezo. We can call it whatever we want, but I think in order to situate that as a kind of fact of present space, returning needs to not be an imperative in a very particular way. But this idea of access points is, I think is really interesting, especially not just thinking about access points to Haiti, but then it forces the question of what are the access points to the United States, right? What are the linkages that happen that sort of do this to the narrative rather than this to the narrative? There's one of the paintings in that Dayon clicked through in the beginning. That was called Louisiana Purchase, Cursed Grounds, Louisiana Purchase, which is a painting of the Atchafalaya Swamp in Louisiana, a property that is part of the United States, but whose acquisition was deeply connected to the Haitian Revolution and the losses incurred by the French during the Haitian Revolution, which forced the sale of the property in the first place, which in some ways is related to why that part of the country has such deep roots in Creole and Haitian culture. So the interconnected linkages between Haiti are here already on a kind of geographical level, historical level, not just evident in the biographies of the four of us. So I love the question, but like I said, I want to deprioritize this idea that returning to one's home is a sort of truth act or something. The truth can be situated differently, I would say.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking a lot about this question and in relationship to like the threads of conversation that we've been having about language too, right? And the difference between, you know, code switching and code meshing, right? This like idea of instead of it being either like a present, and I love that you keep, you know, Didier, you keep like rooting us into like this moment, this like now, right? Not of like a past or just like a hypothetical future, but, you know, the space of what does it mean to, instead of, you know, viewing Haitian American identity as purely a binary, thinking about like what that like meshing looks like, right? And how that exists in its own sort of like its own sort of poetics, right? And I also feel like allowing for, you know, that to also be accessible, right? It allows for, you know, this sort of deflattening that is often asked from us, right? Like this sort of like space of either being, you know, assimilating enough to be like American enough, or, you know, being able to feel anonymous, right? Or being able to, you know, like Madjeen, I felt you so hard when you're like, excuse my curl, because I was like, yes, like, girl, like I feel that, like, but, you know, like being a perfect, being that sort of perfect hybrid immigrant, right? Where you're excellent at both, you know? And so I think this sort of, this meshing space and this space of, you know, what does it mean to not, you know, flatten either identity or either land or either culture into like one thing, but rather allow it to be many different things and have many different access points. Is like, that's the sort of like futurity that I'm looking towards.
Yeah, I think you all hit the nail on the head. I think that, you know, in looking at all of our works, it can help position someone to understand that the world that they're currently in, no matter where they are. And honestly, like language plays a huge part, but also like just visually, like when they see familiar architectural forms or bodies, I think that there are so many things that, you know, anyone can resonate with, and it allows people to find ways to exist in the space without questioning if they belong or not. So there, I think, yeah, there are definitely so many access points, and yeah.
Thank you all. This is a question from Florentine, and it's directed more to Abigail, but I think given the nature of what we've just been discussing, but then also looking at each of your practices, the question is, do you think it's important to show a separation of structural issues and culture when it comes to Haiti? Specifically, the cinder blocks we use to build homes, and how, although beautiful in how we design them, is also catastrophic when it comes to the earthquake the country is prone to.
Yeah, I think, and the beginning of that question, could you repeat that? I'm sorry, because we went into a couple of different spaces, but
so this, do you think it's important to show a separation of structural issues and culture when it comes to Haiti? Specifically, the cinder blocks we use to build homes, and how, although beautiful in how we design them, it is also catastrophic when it comes to the earthquakes we are prone to.
Thank you. I guess I'm wondering, like, what what are we separating that from? Like, where is the separation that we're asking from? Like, I think there's like one place to, idealize something that we find beautiful, right? And there's like a danger in that, right? And understanding the sort of, real structural dangers of that, I think, have their own implications. But I guess I feel like I feel like I'm thinking about like structure in a bit of a different way, and like in particular thinking about those cinder blocks as like a form symbolizing a space of both inside and both outside, and having this like permeability to it, right? And so I don't know if that is necessarily answering your question about separating this idea of structure, but I wonder what you all are thinking of in relationship to that question.
I didn't understand the question. I'll just say that.
Is it asking if it's necessary to separate structures of Haiti versus structures here?
I'm gonna, let's see, we'll reread it, but I think there's some, if we pull it back even further, structural issues, the cinder blocks. Florentine, I think you're still with us. If you want to elaborate in the chat. Oh, raising hand. Okay, let's see if we can bring you forward.
Yeah, the question disappeared from the chat window.
Okay, there we go. Florentine?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, sorry, maybe I didn't write it correctly for you guys. I was just kind of curious because just like the patterns and stuff that Abigail had in her art kind of intrigued. I have a civil engineering background, so the fact that I'm Haitian American and with the civil engineering background, I just always think of, I dig deeper into structural things, and I just found her art very cool, and I just kind of wanted to know, like, when she goes into it and makes her art, whether or not she wants to kind of highlight the architecturalness of Haiti and the beautiful part of that, versus kind of the political aspect that is linked to our architecture, because I know in the beginning when she did her biography, there was a little bit of like how we view Haiti and how it's the country is just looked down upon, and a lot of it is because of the destruction that happens through the earthquake. And that I feel like there's a lot of linkage between architecture, culture, politics and just overall the environment of Haiti. So that I don't know if I provided clarity.
I think you are. I think you know, I guess to your question is like, I don't really separate those things, you know, the political and is anything not political? I don't know. Like, you know, like I feel like there is, you know, they sort of represent themselves in a way, you know, to appreciate the way that something is built is also to like understand that space's history, right? And so oftentimes I'm like really curious about, you know, in OCAP, there's so much like remnants of like of both like Spanish colonizers and French colonizers, right? Like it kind of looks a lot like New Orleans in certain ways with the way that the streets are built. And so, you know, in the remaining architectures of those cities and in like the infrastructure that is either not supported or not reinvested in, you know, like I think it's hard for me to sort of like appreciate to just appreciate, you know, color and form and not reflect on the reality, right? Like the reality that they, you know, there are reasons why we're sort of seeing these repeated forms, right? Because this place has sort of been owned and then, you know, broke free and all of those sort of like undercurrents of narrative. So for me, they're not so much separated, but they sort of exist in one another. I hope that answers your question a little bit more, Florentine.
It does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Did anyone else want to respond to that? I'm mindful of time, and before I do my official send-offs, for the audience, when this group first met, I asked a question: when you think of home, what comes to mind? And after this time together, I'm curious to ask you all that question again.
I think of so many stories, melanges of backgrounds and upbringings. I remember at first I did say chaos and loud noises. I was particularly like explaining what a Flatbush kind of like evokes for me, because there's just so much going on and it's supercharged. But I think in sharing this space, it feels very warm, and there's just so many commonalities, and I think we're all highlighting differences, but there's just so many ways in which we resonate with one another. So I think it just, in all, it just feels very warm.
Mm-hmm.
I think about my family. Sorry, Didier.
No, go for it.
I think about my family. Yeah, wherever they are, as we're like very spread now, I think so much of it becomes like where they are is home for however long that they be. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I I resonate with Lean's answer, and when you first asked the question, the first thing that came to mind was my daughter, and in some ways thinking about how do I describe and imagine Haiti for her, who, you know, is growing up in a completely different environment than I grew up in, even more different than her grandparents grew up in. How does home get situated for her in its most present form? So the construction of home for me immediately points me to her reality.
Mm-hmm. I think when we first spoke, I talked about, I probably talked about something weird like smell or sound or something like that. But I think I do really feel like home has like a scent and like a feeling and a proximity to family, you know, to be able to, you know, be close to one another and like holding on to someone while having a conversation, right? Like that's another sort of feeling, and the sun, and warmth, and the sound of, you know, what a house sounds like when there isn't a generator on, you know, the noises that it makes. That's home to me.
Thank you all so much, Widline, Didier, Madjeen, Abigail, for the generosity that you have shared with us over the last hour and a half. I also want to thank all of the audience members who have stayed with us during midday, whether it's lunch break, you're actually still working, maybe you're not working today, but thank you for sharing this space with us. I just want to give a heads up that we have so many incredible programs coming up in the next few weeks, including offerings from the remaining 3 current artists or actually last iteration artist in residence. Jacoby Satterwhite is on February 3rd. Genesis Jerez, their public program starts on February 10th, and Texas Isaiah's begins on February 17th. All of those are on Thursdays to make it easier to remember and mark on your calendars. For more information, please visit our website or sign up for our Studio Notes newsletter. And if you are or find yourself in New York before February 27th, please visit MoMA PS1 to see Never As I Was, which features Widline's work. Until next time, thank you all so much.
You.
Thank you.